The heavy wooden trunk in the corner of my room had not been opened in nearly 4 decades, but its presence felt like a physical weight against my chest every time I glanced toward it during the quiet hours of the morning. At 102 years old, you begin to realize that the things you own eventually start to own you. And this trunk was the keeper of every bitter memory and unresolved grudge I had ever nurtured since the days of my youth. People often assume that as you age, you naturally become wiser and more peaceful, but the truth is that peace is a choice you have to fight for, and sometimes that fight begins by looking at the garbage you have been stockpiling in the attic of your soul. I sat in my armchair watching the dust motes dance in the sunlight and realized that I was tired of carrying the anger I felt toward a father who never understood me and a husband who took more than he ever gave. For 40 years I had kept these invisible burdens tucked away like precious heirlooms, thinking that my pain gave me an identity or a reason to stay guarded against the world. I remember the day I first started collecting this emotional clutter, believing that if I held on to my resentment long enough, it would somehow serve as justice for the wrongs I had endured. But standing on the precipice of my second century, I saw the absolute absurdity of keeping such filth in my heart when the time I have left is so precious and thin. I reached for my cane and stood up with a shaky resolve because I knew that if I didn't empty that trunk today, I would die still holding on to things that were never meant to be permanent. My hands trembled as I touched the cold metal latch, and I felt a rush of cold air that seemed to smell like old paper and forgotten tears, but I didn't pull away because I was finally ready to face the ghosts. I began to pull out old letters that were filled with accusations and photographs of people whose names I could barely recall, but whose insults still rang in my ears like a constant dissonant hum. Every item I touched represented a moment where I chose to stay small or angry instead of moving toward the light, and I realized that by keeping this garbage, I had effectively stayed trapped in a version of myself that no longer existed. It is a strange thing to realize you have been your own jailer for almost half a century, and the key has been in your hand the entire time. I started to pile the papers in a large black bin, and with every handful I discarded, I felt a peculiar lightness starting to spread from my fingertips to my shoulders, as if the gravity of the earth itself was losing its grip on my tired old bones. I was not just throwing away paper and wood, I was throwing away the version of me that believed she wasn't enough, and the version that thought she needed an apology from the dead to be whole. This was the first step in a long, overdue purging of a life that had become too cluttered with the shadows of the past, and I knew I couldn't stop until every corner of my mind was as clean as a fresh winter morning. As the bin began to fill with the physical remnants of my past, the focus shifted from the tangible objects to the far more dangerous, invisible burdens of guilt that had haunted my sleep since I was a young woman. Guilt is a particularly heavy kind of garbage because it disguises itself as a moral compass when in reality it is just a parasite that feeds on your potential for joy. I sat back down on the edge of my bed and let the memories of my mistakes wash over me without trying to push them away or justify them as I had done for so many years. I thought about the words I should have said to my sister before she passed and the opportunities I walked away from out of a misplaced sense of duty to people who never truly cared for my well-being. This invisible garbage was the most difficult to discard because I had convinced myself that feeling bad about the past was a way of making amends for it. But at 102, I can tell you that your misery doesn't fix anything, and holding on to your failures only ensures that you will repeat them in spirit, even if you cannot repeat them in action. I closed my eyes and imagined myself standing on a high bridge over a fast-moving river, and one by one I took those moments of self-loathing and dropped them into the water, watching them vanish into the foam. I threw away the guilt of not being the perfect mother and the guilt of wanting more for myself than a quiet life of domestic service because those expectations were never mine to fulfill in the first place. The air in the room started to feel thinner and cleaner as I mentally swept away the cobwebs of what if and if only that had obscured my vision for far too long. I realized that the opinions of people who never mattered had been the foundation of my guilt, and I had been living my life to satisfy the ghosts of critics who were long since buried. Why do we give so much power to the voices of the unkind and the small-minded when we are the ones who have to live inside our own skin every single day? I told myself out loud that I was forgiven not because someone else said so, but because I refused to carry the weight of a version of me that was doing the best she could with what she knew at the time. This act of self-forgiveness felt like a surgical removal of a tumor that had been growing for 40 years, and the relief was so profound that I found myself weeping not out of sadness, but out of the sheer shock of being free. I was clearing space for something new even at my age, because as long as there is breath in your lungs, there is a reason to be lighter. The room seemed brighter now, and the shadows in the corners didn't look like lurking monsters anymore, but just like simple lack of light that I now had the power to fill with my own newfound clarity. The third thing I had to throw away was the most insidious form of garbage, which is the fear of the future and the fear of what others might think of my final chapters. It is a common mistake to think that once you reach a certain age, you stop caring about the judgment of the world. But in truth, that fear often grows sharper as you worry about leaving a legacy or being remembered correctly. I realized that I had spent the last several decades making choices based on how they would look to my neighbors or my extended family rather than how they felt in my own soul. This was nothing but vanity disguised as propriety, and it was a heavy burden that served no purpose other than to keep me from being my authentic self. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and saw the deep lines etched into my face, and for the first time I didn't see them as flaws to be hidden, but as a map of a long journey that I was finally proud to have survived. I decided right then to throw away the need for approval and the fear of being seen as an eccentric or difficult old woman, because those labels are just cages that other people use to keep you predictable. I imagined taking all the shoulds and musts that had been dictated to me by society and tossing them into the same black bin as the old letters and the bitter memories. It felt like shedding a heavy winter coat in the middle of a heat wave, and the freedom was intoxicating as I realized that I no longer owed anyone an explanation for how I chose to spend my remaining days. Fear is a thief that steals the present moment by making you worry about a moment that hasn't arrived yet, and I had allowed that thief to live in my house for 40 years without paying rent. No more would I spend my energy wondering if I was being too loud or too quiet or too much for the world to handle, because the world's capacity for me is not my responsibility. I began to laugh a little as I realized how much energy I had wasted trying to fit into a mold that was never designed for a woman of my spirit. I threw away the fear of death itself because I understood that death is just the final shedding of the physical container, and there is nothing to fear if you have already emptied yourself of the garbage that makes life heavy. By letting go of the need to control how I am perceived, I gained the power to simply exist as I am, which is the greatest gift any human can give themselves, regardless of their age. The silence in the house was no longer lonely, but filled with a quiet strength that came from knowing I was finally the only master of my internal landscape, and no one else's opinion could ever touch me again. The final category of garbage I had to eliminate was the habit of comparison and the lingering resentment over the paths not taken, which had acted like a slow-acting poison in my veins. It is so easy to look at the lives of others and imagine that they found a secret spring of happiness that you somehow missed, but this is the ultimate deception of the mind. I spent 40 years looking at the successes of my peers and the perceived ease of their lives while ignoring the struggle and the internal battles they were undoubtedly fighting. This comparison was a form of self-torture that kept me from appreciating the unique beauty of my own struggle and the strength I had developed because of the obstacles I faced. I took those feelings of why not me, and it should have been different, and I gathered them up like handfuls of dry weeds to be burned in the fire of my new awareness. I realized that my life was not a mistake, and my path was not a failure just because it didn't look like a storybook or a magazine cover. Every hardship had been a teacher, and every disappointment had been a refining fire, and by resenting them, I was resenting the very things that made me the resilient woman standing here today at 102. I threw away the jealousy I felt toward those who seemed to have it easier because I understood now that ease is not the same thing as growth, and I would rather have my scars and my wisdom than a smooth life with a shallow heart. I stopped comparing my slow pace to the frantic speed of the world, and I embraced the rhythm of my own heart, which had stayed loyal to me through a century of change. This was the final layer of the invisible burden, and as it left me, I felt a profound sense of integration where my past and my present finally stopped fighting each other and began to dance. I realized that the garbage I had been keeping was just a collection of excuses for why I wasn't happy, and by throwing them away, I was left with the simple, undeniable truth that happiness is a state of being that exists beneath the clutter. I looked around my room and it looked different, not because the furniture had moved, but because the woman looking at it was no longer viewing it through the lens of lack. I was whole and I was sufficient, and I was finally clean of the debris that had been clogging my spirit for nearly half my life. It was as if I had been living in a house with boarded up windows, and I had finally ripped the boards down to let the light flood into every dark corner and every dusty hallway. Now that the trunk was empty and the bin was full of the remnants of a burdened life, I walked to my window and looked out at the world with eyes that felt decades younger. The process of throwing away 40 years of garbage was not an ending, but a spectacular beginning that most people think is impossible at my age. I felt a surge of energy that had nothing to do with my physical health and everything to do with the fact that my spirit was no longer dragging an anchor behind it. I realized that the secret to a peaceful life after 60 or at any age is not about what you accumulate, but about what you are brave enough to let go of before it consumes you. You are probably carrying these same burdens right now, believing that they are a necessary part of who you are, but I am here to tell you from the finish line that they are nothing but heavy trash. Anger and guilt and fear and the opinions of the unimportant are the thieves of your vitality, and they will steal every drop of joy if you let them. Do not wait until you are 102 to decide that you deserve to be light, because every day you spend holding on to garbage is a day you lose to the shadows. I stood there feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin, and I knew that for the first time in 40 years, I was truly present in my own life without the interference of old ghosts. I have 4 things left now, which are love and gratitude and curiosity and a deep abiding peace that comes from knowing I am finally empty of everything that doesn't matter. This is the hard lesson that took me a century to learn, but it is the only one that truly counts in the end. I watched the garbage truck pull away from the curb later that afternoon, and I felt a joy so sharp it almost hurt because I knew that my invisible burdens were being hauled away to the landfill of history where they belonged. I turned back to my room, which now felt like a sanctuary of possibility rather than a museum of regrets, and I sat down to write a new story. This story wouldn't be about what I lost or what was taken from me, but about the incredible lightness of being a woman who finally chose herself over her pain. The world is so much bigger when you aren't looking at it through the bars of a self-made cage, and I intend to savor every second of this newfound space. To anyone listening, I say this with all the love of a century of living, which is to stop keeping the garbage and start living in the light, because you were never meant to be a storage unit for misery. You were meant to be a vessel for life, and that life is waiting for you to clear the way so it can finally flow through you as clear and as bright as a mountain stream.